Welcome back to Sacred Arc, a podcast about life, loss, and the soul in between. I'm Kimberley, a certified grief counselor, death doula, and whether I wanted to be or not, a lifelong student of grief. Before we begin, I just want to say thank you for being here. Every person who listens becomes part of this community, and that means more to me than I can ever fully express. You may be listening from somewhere completely different, carrying a grief that looks nothing like someone else's. But there is something that connects us here, the experience of loving, losing, and learning to keep living. Your presence here helps keep this space alive. You can help this community continue to grow by following the podcast, sharing an episode with someone who might need it, leaving a comment or review, or connecting with me on social media at Sacred Arc Podcast. And if you feel called to work with me or just reach out and say hello or share your story with me, please use the contact link in my bio. I would love to hear from you. Thank you for bringing your story into this space and sharing your beautiful energy with me. Take a deep breath in, settle in, and let's begin. There are certain phrases that seem to be everywhere right now, and one of them is generational trauma. We touched base on this in an early episode, and I had a lot of questions that came in about what generational trauma actually is, and that's why I decided to make this episode. It's become part of everyday conversation. People use it all over social media, in therapy, in parenting discussions, in family conversations. And while I'm genuinely grateful we're talking more openly about mental health and family dynamics, I also think something interesting has happened. The term has become so common that sometimes we've started using it to describe almost any painful experience. I've heard people describe everything from strict parenting to teaching a child a bad word as generational trauma. I've heard every difficult parent called abusive, every ex called a narcissist, every disagreement labeled toxic. And while those words describe very real experiences for many people, they don't describe every difficult experience. So today I'd like to slow the conversation down because I think generational trauma deserves more than becoming another social media buzzword or hashtag. It deserves understanding. Today's episode isn't about blaming previous generations. It's about understanding how pain travels through families, how healing travels through families, and how every one of us has the opportunity to change what gets passed forward. At its core, generational trauma happens when unresolved trauma in one generation affects the emotional, relational, behavioral, or psychological well-being of future generations. It often begins with experiences like abuse, neglect, addiction, violence, war, extreme poverty, abandonment, family secrets, mental illness, severe loss, and even chronic instability. Sometimes the original trauma happened decades before we were even born, yet its effects continue showing up inside a family. Not because trauma is inherited the way we inherit eye color, but because children don't simply inherit genetics. They inherit environments. They inherit beliefs, ways of communicating, ways of coping, ways of loving, ways of avoiding, ways of surviving. Children are always watching. They're learning what relationships look like, what conflict looks like, whether emotions are welcome, whether affection is safe, whether vulnerability is allowed, and these lessons become part of the emotional blueprint they carry into adulthood. So let's talk about what generational trauma is not. And I think this distinction matters because not every unhealthy behavior qualifies as generational trauma. A parent forgetting a school play? Human. Teaching your child a rude word or gesture? Poor judgment. Being overly strict? It's a parenting style. Being overly permissive? Another parenting style. Losing your temper once in a while? Human. Making mistakes? Also human. Those experiences may have consequences. They may even leave emotional wounds, but they don't automatically become generational trauma. Generational trauma happens when unresolved wounds become repeated family patterns that continue affecting future generations. For example, a child grows up emotionally neglected. So then that child becomes an adult who struggles to express affection. Their own children grow up feeling unseen, and those children later struggle with intimacy themselves. Now we're looking at a pattern, a wound that keeps moving. I think one of the challenges we face today is that psychology has become part of everyday language. In many ways, that's wonderful. People are talking about boundaries, therapy, abuse, mental health. Those conversations matter so much. But sometimes we begin assigning clinical labels before we've really understood the situation. Suddenly, every ex is a narcissist, like I mentioned earlier. Every difficult relationship is abuse. Every uncomfortable emotion is trauma. Every parent caused generational trauma. But life is usually more nuanced than that. Sometimes your ex wasn't a narcissist. Sometimes they were just selfish, immature, dishonest, or simply a poor partner. That doesn't automatically mean they have narcissistic personality disorder. Likewise, sometimes our parents made mistakes because they were human, not because they intentionally traumatized us. That doesn't erase the impact, but impact and diagnosis aren't the same thing. And understanding the difference allows us to have more honest conversations. One question I find helpful is this: did this become a lasting pattern that shaped generations, or did someone just simply make a mistake? Those are very different questions to ask, because not every painful experience becomes trauma, and not every family conflict becomes abuse. Not every difficult relationship becomes generational trauma. And sometimes, if we label everything as trauma, we unintentionally give away our own power. Because eventually healing asks us a different question, not only what happened to me, but also, what am I going to do with what happened? One of the most surprising things I've learned is that trauma isn't always passed down through what happened. Sometimes it's passed down through what never happened, the hugs that were never given, the apologies never spoken, the emotions never discussed, the affections never shown, the safety never provided. Families pass down silence just as easily as they pass down chaos. Children learn how to communicate, how to love, how to argue, how to trust, how to cope, simply by watching the people raising them. If those adults are living from unhealed wounds, those patterns often continue without anybody realizing it. There's also something to mention here about every family having rules. Some are spoken, most aren't. Rules like we don't talk about feelings, or we don't ask for help, we don't discuss addiction, we don't question authority, or we don't air our family problems. We handle things ourselves. Children absorb these messages long before they understand them consciously. Then they grow up believing those invisible rules are simply how life works, until one day someone begins asking different questions. Generational trauma doesn't only show up through abuse or addiction. Sometimes it shows up quietly through the relationships we witness growing up. Many people grow up believing they'll never repeat the mistakes they saw in their own family, and then years later, they find themselves struggling with some of those very same patterns. Not because they're bad people, not because they're destined to repeat history, but because relationship patterns are often learned long before we're even aware we're learning them. A child who grows up watching constant conflict may come to believe conflict is simply what love looks like. A child who grows up with emotional distance may struggle with intimacy. A child raised around dishonesty may learn that hiding the truth feels safer than having difficult conversations, and sometimes these patterns even show up through infidelity. Now, cheating itself is not a generational trauma. It's a behavior, a choice. But what can become generational are the wounds underneath it: avoidance, secrecy, poor communication, emotional disconnection, fear of vulnerability, or unresolved childhood wounds. The child grows up watching one parent repeatedly betray the other. They're not just witnessing infidelity, they're witnessing a model for relationships. They're learning something about trust and commitment, about conflict, about honesty. They may grow up believing people always leave, you can't trust anyone, or relationships aren't safe. Or even without realizing it, they may repeat some of those unhealthy patterns themselves, not because they wanted to, but because familiar often feels normal, even when it's painful. I've also noticed that generational trauma often survives through silence. Families don't talk about affairs, addiction, abuse, financial struggles, mental illness. Everyone knows. No one says anything. silence has a remarkable ability to protect unhealthy patterns. Because what remains hidden is often much harder to heal. But healing begins when someone finally says, "This happened," or "This affected me. I don't want this pattern to continue," not to shame anyone, but to bring truth into the light. One of the reasons this topic matters so much to me is because I've lived it. My mother struggled with alcoholism. There was abuse in my childhood. There were family dynamics that felt completely normal because they were all I'd ever known. And for a long time, I found myself asking why. Why did these patterns exist? Where did they begin? And eventually I realized I was asking the wrong question. Instead of asking who's to blame, I started asking what happened here. Those are very different questions. One keeps us looking for someone to punish. The other helps us understand, and understanding is often where healing begins. But I do want to be very clear about something. Understanding someone's story is not the same thing as excusing what they did. Someone can have trauma and still be responsible for the way they treat other people. Someone can have suffered deeply and still cause real harm. Both things can be true. Understanding simply gives us context, and context often creates compassion. Not necessarily reconciliation, not necessarily trust, not necessarily closeness, but compassion. The ability to recognize that the people who hurt us were often carrying something themselves. Again, not always, but often. The alcoholic parent may have grown up with alcoholism. The emotionally unavailable parent may never have experienced emotional safety themselves. The abusive parent may have been raised in violence. The person who never learned healthy communication may have never seen it modeled. That doesn't erase the pain they caused, but it reminds us that pain usually doesn't begin with one generation. And I think this is where people sometimes become uncomfortable, because they hear the word compassion and assume it means what happened was okay. It doesn't. Compassion is not approval. It's not permission. It isn't pretending something didn't hurt. It simply means seeing another person's humanity. I can understand why someone became who they became without agreeing with what they did. I can have empathy for someone's suffering without accepting harmful behavior. Those ideas are not opposites. They can exist together. My grandmother, who I've talked about extensively on this podcast, used to say something that has stayed with me my entire life. When you point one finger at someone else, you've got three pointing back at you. And the older I get, the more wisdom I find in that. Because it's very easy to identify the flaws in other people, but it's much harder to identify them in ourselves. It's easy to look at our parents and say they should have done better. They made mistakes. They hurt me. And sometimes those things are absolutely true. But healing eventually asks us to look in the mirror too, because if we're honest, most of us have hurt someone. Most of us have acted from our own wounds. Most of us have repeated patterns we wish we hadn't. Maybe it wasn't exactly what our parents did, but it was something. Perhaps we've avoided difficult conversations. Perhaps we've been emotionally unavailable. Perhaps we've been dishonest or struggled with our own relationships. Perhaps we've even betrayed someone's trust, not because we're terrible people, but because we're human. And recognizing that isn't about shame, it's about humility, and humility creates growth. Sometimes I think we speak about generational trauma as though it belongs entirely to previous generations, as though we're finally the generation that's going to get everything right. But I wonder, what will our children say about us? What blind spots will they see that we can't? What patterns are we living today that feel perfectly normal but won't feel healthy 20 or 30 years from now? That thought doesn't discourage me, it humbles me. Because suddenly the conversation changes from "how could they?" to "I wonder what they were carrying." And I think that's the question that opens the door to compassion. One of the things I've learned is that healing requires two things to exist at the same time: the courage to acknowledge what happened and the willingness to take responsibility for what we do next. Because blaming our parents forever doesn't heal us. Blaming our grandparents forever doesn't heal us, but understanding what happened may be the beginning of healing, but it isn't the end. At some point we have to ask ourselves, now that I know this, what am I going to do with it? What patterns am I repeating? What relationships am I responsible for? What beliefs no longer serve me? Or what kind of parent, partner, friend, or family member do I want to become? Because healing isn't about proving someone else was wrong. It's about becoming healthier ourselves. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about healing is that healing means identifying who hurt us. And while understanding what happened is incredibly important, that's not where the work ends. Because if healing only becomes, this is my mother's fault, this is my father's fault, or this is my grandparents' fault, then we can spend the rest of our lives trapped in the very story we're trying to escape. The irony is that constantly pointing fingers can keep us emotionally tied to the very thing we're hoping to heal from. Acknowledging harm matters. Naming abuse matters. Telling the truth matters. I'm not suggesting we pretend difficult things didn't happen. I'm not suggesting we excuse harmful behavior. I'm talking about what happens after we've acknowledged it. Because eventually growth asks us to stop asking only who hurt me and begin asking, who do I want to become? I've come to believe that generational trauma isn't broken through blame. It's broken through awareness, through accountability, through compassion, through choosing something different. If someone spent their entire life criticizing others and we spend our lives criticizing them, we may unknowingly continue the very cycle we're trying to escape. The cycle begins to change when someone chooses curiosity instead of judgment, understanding instead of bitterness, healthy boundaries instead of resentment, growth instead of blame. That doesn't mean we forget. It doesn't mean we excuse. It means we stop allowing yesterday to decide our tomorrow. I believe every family eventually needs someone willing to become the turning point. The person who asks questions no one asked before. The person who decides to go to therapy, who learns emotional regulation. The person who apologizes or breaks addiction. The person who learns healthy communication, and the person who says, this pattern stops with me. That isn't easy work. Sometimes it means grieving the family you wish you had. Sometimes it means setting boundaries. Sometimes it means becoming the person you needed when you were younger, and sometimes it simply means choosing kindness in places where anger once lived. One thing we don't talk about nearly enough is that healing can also become generational. Just as pain moves through families, so can resilience. When someone learns healthy communication, their children benefit. When someone learns to apologize, future generations benefit. When someone breaks an addiction, future generations benefit. When someone chooses honesty instead of secrecy, their children inherit something different. Healing creates ripples just as surely as trauma does, and I find that incredibly hopeful because it means every small step we take toward healing has the potential to affect people we may never even meet, our children, our grandchildren, future generations. If you've started noticing unhealthy patterns in your own family, you're not betraying your family by acknowledging them. If you've chosen a different path, you're not abandoning your family. If you've spent years untangling beliefs and behaviors that don't feel like your own, you're not broken. You're doing deeply important work. And if you've discovered that some of your own behaviors came from wounds you never chose, remember this. Understanding your past isn't about becoming trapped there. It's about becoming free enough to choose differently. I think one of the greatest gifts we can leave the future generations isn't perfection, it's awareness. Because awareness creates choice, and choice creates change. Every family carries stories. Stories of resilience, stories of survival, stories of heartbreak, stories of love. Most families carry all of them. The question isn't whether your family was perfect. None of ours were. The question is, which stories do you want to continue carrying, and which ones are you finally ready to set down? Before we close today, I want to invite you to just close your eyes here for a moment. If it feels okay for you, take one slow breath in through your nose and gently let it go through your mouth. Now think about the people who came before you, the things they survived, the burdens they carried, the wounds they never healed, the love they gave as best they knew how. Now ask yourself, what do I want future generations to inherit from me? Not financially, emotionally, spiritually, relationally. What kind of legacy do I want to leave? Just sit with that for a moment. Generational trauma reminds us that pain can travel through families, but so can healing, so can resilience, so can forgiveness, and so can love. Maybe we don't get to choose the family story we were born into, but we do get to help write the chapters that come next, and perhaps that's one of the most helpful truths of all. Because sometimes the most powerful legacy we leave behind isn't what we pass on, it's what we finally choose to heal. This has been Sacred Arc. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll meet you again in the space between.